Hey guys, how you all doing there? Just my little flag there hanging up there. It's not, it's a bit wet the beaten. It's a bit stained, so some people, that's not the way to treat a flag. But I look at the flag in the morning and it reminds me about what I'd like New Zealand to be and what I believe that flag actually stands for. And art's a very interesting thing. It's all in the eye of the beholder. Somebody wants to walk on that flag or any flag. I personally think, well, it's just a flag at the end of the day. The symbols are stronger than the piece of cloth or fabric upon which they are made. However, it is somewhat ironic that, for example, if you were to burn an American flag, or even more likely a symbol of Allah, the consequences would be probably a lot more severe than it happens in New Zealand, because the irony is that the symbols upon which that Union Jack stands for in the corner, which I'm gonna come from a constitutional viewpoint, which I think is very important, because I think this Union Jack, in the context of the artist Diana Prince, is really showing her ignorance, and unfortunately so is the curator of the Suter Art Gallery, with the representation that it stands for, stands for colonialism, also the inference that it stands for colonialism. And I'll explain you why. The first concept is that the Union Jack in the corner of the New Zealand flag, the origins actually come from the creation basically of the Australian state. Believe the date I want to go with is... I want to go with, no, I won't even throw down the dates because I'll get myself in trouble. But it's before we actually brought the flag into our particular sphere of realm. And the reason why the Union Jack was picked, and another reason why kind of walking over here, but the reason why it was actually picked was that basically it came out of the workers in Australia being really annoyed that they were being largely harassed by the squatters. Now in 1853, they came out with this little baby. And it's an interesting thing. We'll start actually off here. And the original one actually has a square. This is actually a rather symbolistic version of it. But it's that's the symbol of the Eureka, which is a combination of English and Italian miners, many of them veterans of California, gold mining, basically rose up in protest to the general gain harassment of the not the crown but the wealthy richy miners and whatnot, who were trying to basically extort them and make it so that only rich, the big boys were allowed to go mining, and anybody else would be basically fined and harassed off the goldfields. And this led to an armed uprising, which led for a very short, sharp battle, which the majority of the protesters in Eureka didn't actually win. But it created a conversation, and the outcome of it was the Union Jack and the Australian. And the Union Jack specifically stood not for we want England to rule over it, but they wanted the Westminster Palace. And this is where Diana Prince is showing her ignorance, because the Union Jack doesn't represent the Buckingham Palace. So there was a symbol that represented Buckingham Palace, then her arguments of colonialism would be absolutely on the money. However, the Westminster basically was saying that, actually the Union Jack represents the people, that everybody had inherent rights, and that basically the Crown couldn't go around doing what it actually wanted. And this brings in the next equation, and this is again the sad aspect of it, is that if we had an educated media that was willing to actually address the subject in an academic sense as opposed to trying to have one agenda, we might have a little bit more representational understanding of what that flag is. But as I've said previously, there is a deliberate campaign to attack that flag, and it comes from the left and it comes from the right. The left turn around and often refer to the idea of Tino Rino Rangatera. Pardon my mispronunciation, but it's the concept in that is that the idea is that power in New Zealand comes from the king, or the chiefs, and the idea is the inference is coming from this aristocracy. This is actually very much a Governor Grey interpretation of where the power sits, and came, that's what 1840 was, that they were trying to kind of make it so that if they only had to deal with a couple of people at the top of the village pole, then they could actually turn around and easily, get them to sell the land and undermine the actual, the indigenous people of the area, because they could appoint some of the chief, and then, lo and behold, they would then turn around and sell it to landowners, such as was the case of Donald Maclean, who went on to be the first Minister of Native Affairs. And he widely misused his powers to actually come up with a very large bit of block of land for himself. And that again was what the Crown was meant to represent. Under the Treaty of Waitangi, or the Clause 2 of the Treaty of Waitangi, it's the basically recognition that every single Maori person, whether they are a king or a peasant or a slave, had the right, they had the protection of English law, and specifically Westminster law. And in return, the part of the deal, or the recognition of that particular land, the contract, was that New Zealand, the Crown, would actually represent the sovereignty of the Maori tribes. In 2010, this idea, basically the idea on the road to getting rid of the New Zealand flag, because in the end of the day, the irony is that that flag actually is a very powerful tool of protection for Maori sovereign rights. But in 2010, John Key, a man known for his wonderful love of all things Indigenous, and he doesn't like money, and he all loves the community, all these things that we know about John Key and his friends at the Chow Brothers, really had a deep loving care of New Zealand sovereignty, having not actually lived here his entire life. But good old Prince John got into a deal with Peter Sharples and the Maori Party, who ultimately ended up voting, actually acting much more conservatively and in the interest of the older and more corporate-aligned members of the iwi, and thus the Maori Party got their asses handed to them after the first term, because they'd been largely felt by their own voters, electorate, that they had betrayed what they stood and represented for. Which is what I could have told them anyway, because back in 2010, they began the constitutional debate. And again, there was this idea presented in 2010, the parliamentary bill at the beginning of the conversation, was that in the Māoridom world, all the power was based in Māoridom. And they went and had a constitutional panel, which Miramara Bratton for the Maori Law Review reviewed, and she came away very worried and saying, where is the reference in this constitutional conversation, which is, by the way, a bromance between Peter Sharples and their old boys network there, and John Key and the Bankers Bro network over there. She said, where is the mention of whānau? Where is the mention of hapu? It wasn't there. And neither was any mention of Article 29 of the Magna Carta, which is largely what that, Union Jack represents. So no, you can't just have one big poo bar sitting at the top of the food chain dictating to everybody else. Now, bear in mind, I just want to quickly put that into context, because when colonial Europe arrived, when the colonial powers arrived in New Zealand at that time, New Zealand, as shown in the 1835 Declaration of Independence, which makes a very good point of using the word hapu, New Zealand was power base was like that of the North American Indians, not based in one single power basis with one great king Pooh Bah at the top, but it was a series of tribes and families, which included Rangatira, but it also represented understanding that hapu in itself could be separate from didn't necessarily have to answer per se to the Rangatira. This idea that some tribes are more equal than others, by the way, is also largely replicated in the Takarau Revolution of Fiji in 1987, which was largely financed by mining companies and mining interests. Very much similar to the people that John Key was running with when he formed this bromance with Peter Sharples in 2010 and decided, no, we're not going to make any reference to the people who aren't Rangatiras having any power in terms of hapu and whānau. And no, we won't mention the English statutes, the idea that every New Zealand citizen has inalienable rights, as reinforced by the Bill of Rights 1688, which is part of the English statutes as well, and as I said, Article 29. Bill of Rights 1688 is a very funny one, because you notice all these freedom movements that have popped up and have suddenly made out like, oh, they really care about the flag, and like, great. I love the fact that Destiny flags in New Zealand, the Destiny Party, who are basically a bunch of racist, homophobic, bully boy arseholes, suddenly we're like, oh, they've got the patriotism of New Zealand, because the thing is, that's absolutely nonsense, because again, that Union Jack and civil rights basically is the idea that everybody has rights. See, Brian Tamaki's not very good at that. He's really good at you only have rights if you believe in what I say. So to have him defending the New Zealand flag, it's kind of like almost like a psychological warfare, reverse psychology. It's designed to make people who may oppose Brian Tamaki to immediately have this gut-wrenching, like, oh, if he believes that, then I won't believe that either. It really does annoy me, because the people who come in and get, decided they're going to pick up the flag and protect it, and then suddenly protect the New Zealand rights, so they don't have a very good human rights record themselves, and they should really just shut their frickin' yaps. Same with people like Karen Spin, Sue Gray, who loves to be seen with Brian Tamaki. All of these people, oddly enough, talk about their love of freedom, but none of them will talk about the Bill of Rights 1688. It is, without exception, the quintessential point of constitutional law in New Zealand. You cannot talk about the New Zealand Constitution without talking about the Bill of Rights 1688. And how do I actually know this? Because, well, golly God, gosh darn it, I actually have a degree in political science. Go and look me up internationally. People do know that I know a thing or two about constitutional law in New Zealand. Not necessarily the world's greatest expert, but I do have an above layman's understanding of this topic. And both in terms of that as a historian as well. So, actually, I do know what I'm talking about. The New Zealand flag, in terms of the idea of the stars, again, let's talk about those 4 stars. And let's go back and have a look at them. Now, there is actually a double cross, and Ralph Hotry, who's a very clever artist, did a thing up in the Temple Gallery in Dunedin about 2006 called the Triple Cross, where he's a clever man. But this is again the Eureka flag. It represents, again, they put the Southern flag cross in there, and we'll come back to that in a second as well. And that's right over there is the Union Cross that we've talked about. Well, sorry, the 4 stars as well that we see there. Okay, cool. Now, a couple of points. First of all, the reason why the Southern Cross appears in both the Eureka and the New Zealand flag is not just because we have the Southern Cross in our stars. It's a little bit deeper than that. Initially, when they're standing up against the big mining companies and the landowners, they were discussing, what they were going to stand for their representation of symbolism and freedom. And the people at Eureka, which also included a large contingent of Irish, probably weren't going to actually turn around and salute the British flag. Because again, for a lot of the Sinn Féinians, that's the Irish activists or separatists that many of them were actually sent to Australia as convicts labourers for very low works. They, again, probably didn't have that great understanding of the Union Jack, and they had, again, a knee-jerk reaction, not understanding that, probably their experience with what Westminster says and what it did were 2 different things, but, they were, again, no, we're not going to go into the Union Jack, but we'll go into the Southern Cross because we understand what that represents symbolically, and we're okay with that. So the Southern Cross actually comes from the Scottish Arbroath, which is near a place called St Vigins, and my name's Ben Vigin. It comes from the same origins, which is around about 1066. And basically what it was again put in there for was basically so the Scots say, well, no, you might be the English crown, but we are a separate people, and we have our own sovereignty, and we want this particularly acknowledged in the Arbroath Accords, which became pretty much the kind of like the building block upon which Lord Black, thus of Black's Law, would basically create or frame the Magna Carta, which then went on to be largely used in the Americas for the American Constitution and throughout the Commonwealth. Now, for example, the First Tribe Nations of the Inuits of the North America, Canada in 2017, they used Commonwealth law or Westminster law to basically say that when the government there tried to put in the TPA with its investment state settlement dispute clauses, they went, no, you're actually reaching our rights under this contract we have with the Commonwealth ground in terms of what our actual rights of First Nation people are and general Commonwealth law in general. And again, it largely stopped the TPA, or stalled the TPA, because it's still out there, and the ISD clauses are still a rather controversial creature out there. And that's what people like David Seymour from the Atlas Network would love to dearly have a situation where they could actually get rid of that New Zealand flag. You might think that you'd be getting rid of colonialism, but in actual fact, you'll be removing part of the constitutional mechanics. Not replacing the flag itself. A flag by itself is just a flag, and I've had this conversation previously during the TPA where Andrew Geddes on national TV turned around and said, "There's no such thing as due authority." Well, Andrew Geddes, you're an idiot. And if the fact that you are a professor of law and you don't know that is a bit of a worry. And that's what I'm saying. That's what we're up against. And again, that's why you won't see that clip online anymore, because they had to pull it because they knew that he had actually defamed me. So, you know, and they know that they defamed me because I let my lawyers know that they defamed me, and they basically decided to take the better part of cautious and pull it down. Now, you can go and step on me if you wish as a flag, but it's very, very sad because, said again, you know, you get rid of that flag, not just the flag, but then you also get rid of the coat of arms, and then you get rid of the currency, and you remove all the things from New Zealand, which has been happening since 1986, and more often than not done with due process. When we removed the Constitutional Act in 1986, that law change wasn't done correctly. It was Justice Cook turned around and described it, quote unquote, as a legal fiction. And that law, that same law, which was basically breached according to Fitzgerald versus Muldoon 1975, as more as recently as 2020, that case was used again in the Privy Council to basically turn around and say, when Boris Johnson tried to shut down Parliament, say, I'm the Prime Minister, I can do what I want. He said, well, no, you can't, because actually the Bill of Rights, and cited the New Zealand case, says that politicians don't get to do just what they want. They actually have to go through a due process like the rest of us. And they cannot go around passing laws that empower themselves, which basically is what happened in 1986. And that became the opening gates for the creation of the Human Rights Bill 1991, and we already had a Bill of Rights. And again, this wasn't put out very widely to the media, or what the Bill of Rights 1680 is, and what does the old language mean in modern terminology. All of this stuff was, we weren't given a very fair. The New Zealand public were not given a lot of education on this matter, and so a lot of myths have been allowed to grow, so that you can even have the curator of a major gallery not knowing actually any of this basic civic stuff. It's a real worry. I mean, a person that runs a gallery of that standard, you expect to be reasonably educated. Because I'm not talking stuff here that like high advanced academic. This is pretty basic stuff. This is basic history. So, 1991, we turned around and we absorbed the United Nations. And it was done in a way, again, Jeffrey Powers, what's the name of his book? I think it's not unconditional powers. It's basically saying that, New Zealand, we've got a problem because our checks and balances are rapidly falling apart. And they're falling apart because these sort of law changes take place, and none of our national media, again, have the education to understand that when this happens, to challenge them, because they're just, we are not getting a very good quality level of, our current affairs is just not what it used to be. So the 1991 Bill of Rights is based on the UN conventions, which basically the way it's set up, because we didn't end up having our own powers entrenched them, we immediately by default switch over to the United Nations. And basically what's happened since 1955, the terminology of what means human rights and inalienable rights, all these things, have very subtly changed within the United Nations in New York, where I was there last year, and I made a point to go down to the UN and take some photos and have a little look around what else is around the UN. Very interesting, by the way. The definition of basically that human rights on what we would refer to the New York Conventions, the New York Accords sometime, also the building blocks of things like the TPA's investment state settlement dispute clauses, is they're based on New York law, which originally New York was New Amsterdam, so its state laws are actually based in a kind of combination between Dutch and customary law from when the Dutch East Tea Company, a corporation, actually ran New York. And that's pretty much what the TPA is saying. It's going, well, actually what we do is the world's now run by corporations, and if you get rid of, in the case of New Zealand saying, all our constitutional protections, then you can get good old Shane Jones pushing in his fast track bill and his special economic zones, which again you have the Te Rangatira, this idea, it comes across, it's presented itself as the alternative extreme left wing to the outright wing, as you see the Brian Tamaki trying to embrace the New Zealand flag, just like you see the Eureka flag has been embraced by the far right overseas, which is very heartbreaking, because that flag is not embracing far right qualities at all, I can assure you. And, so you have, I think it was Bryce Edwards actually pointing out the amount of money from the oil industries going into Te Mana and the Waipara Trust, which, if you go and look at the Waipara Trust in terms of who they work for in relation to mining companies and other various associated neoliberal ratbags, I think you would maybe find yourself going, well, actually, maybe possibly that the Rio Te Rangatira, which has no heritage or legacy, or genuine Maori legacy, is not actually pro-Indigenous rights as it seems in the first place. The point of those stars again in the New Zealand flag, when the original one in 1835, each of those points represented a whānau or clan that had actually joined into an alliance with the Crown, the Westminster Crown, not the Buckingham Palace Crown, and saying, yeah, okay, we're willing to acknowledge that you kind of, make big rules in terms of laws and government structure and so on, but at the end of the day, we still get to control what goes on in our marae, and we can't have people coming around shooting at us with muskets, because that would be, under this alliance, we don't do that anymore. We all accept that we've all got rights, and that we've got a right to live in peace and harmony, and that we all aren't an aristocratic nation, but we are actually one big tribe, and that we all respect each other, and with a framework. So, that's my little rant, and again, I'll put it up on YouTube, and again, the algorithms will probably make sure that not enough people see it as they should actually do, and we'll get things like the Nelson Mail, again, ramming hold pieces of people that are meant to be educated, saying really nonsensical things about how that the Union Jack represents colonialism and Buckingham Palace and the Queen, when in actual fact, the Union Jack actually didn't represent that. It was an embracing of a process of democracy. It represents democracy, and that's what I thought in our country, why we're so proud of this flag, because it does actually represent the fact that in this country you don't just have a whole bunch of guys sitting at the top saying we're the chiefs do as we say, but actually everybody, like a tribe, like a hapu, and even down to the whānau level, actually has a say, and they have certain rights. So I don't want to go walking on that, and it seems really very sad and quite deliberate that both the far left and the far right, who, when I look at the monetary sources of the people that are funding these most extremist groups, get the kind of popularity. Of course, the algorithms, which again, the tech companies get to control, they'll get to decide who gets to see which posts, and so they'll ramp up the far left and they'll ramp up the far right, and ultimately, at the end of the day, the thing that will actually suffer is 150 years worth of stability in New Zealand, where we've had a very good relationship, where it hasn't always been perfect, but as Willie Jackson's once said, it's been like, New Zealand race relationships have been like two old men, like the old guys on the Muppets, sitting at the back of the room, having a good old yin-yang and a grumble, but bit by bit, actually progress occurs, and we end up this country that has, in so many ways, not just in terms of race relations, but women's suffragettes rights, the freedom of expression, to be this amazing little democratic country, anti-nuclear legacy, that's part of our process. And it seems to me, in the last 35 years, neoliberalism, neoconservatism has joined forces to kind of largely undermine all of those things, which actually are, to my mind, they are a boon to the Indigenous rights. Not perfect, but what they're talking about is replacing it, is pulling it away, so that we're a country now where only one group of people who happen to be born under a certain bloodline get to have any power, other than, of course, their mates and the corporations. And we saw how that turned out in Fiji. It hasn't done Fiji any favours. So anyway, that's my little thought. That's my little art history aspect of it, because again, my education of this comes from an historic and a background education in political science, but my mother was also an art history and a painter and a very good symbolist. So, these things about heraldry, I've grown up all my life understanding them, and when I went to school, I thought a lot of this stuff was actually pretty well known, but it seems the older I get, the more and more we don't know what's going on, and we seem very confused, and the confusion seems to be very much intent at actually You know, it's deliberate. Anyway, have a good day, and that's my thoughts on that matter.